everyone. My name is Allegra. Me and she will be your host today. Welcome to today's webinar. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to all of you who have attended previous webinars. We hope you're enjoying them, and if so, please don't forget to leave us a comment, subscribe, or follow us on social media. So we are IFB UK, Association of Black and Minority Ethnic Engineers, and we aim to create engagement, provide support, and promote higher achievement in education and engineering to young and experienced professionals, as well as students. So during today's webinar, we'll be learning about the role of clinical and biomedical engineering in general, and especially in this COVID-19 crisis. We have the amazing opportunities to be speaking to 4 panelists today. So it's my pleasure to introduce Nana Odom. She's the Clinical Engineering Manager at Cleveland Clinic, London. Thank you for being here with us today. Can you please introduce yourself?
Thank you, Allegra, and thank you, AFBE, for this wonderful opportunity. It's such a great pleasure to be sharing this platform with my clinical engineering colleagues. And so, yeah, it's a really great opportunity. I am a clinical engineering manager for Cleveland Clinic in London. And so, yeah.
Okay, thank you. So we also have Didier Akinlui. Apologize if I butchered your name. He's the Chief Biomedical Engineer at Guy's and St. Thomas NHS Foundation Trust. Can you also please introduce yourself?
Great, yeah, good evening everyone. Yeah, also just like to say, a real pleasure to be here. Yeah, I'm based in an NHS trust. I'll say more of that when I will put my slides on later, but just to say thanks to AFBE for having us on this evening. Thanks.
Great. We also have Eskinder Solomon. He's a consultant clinical scientist at Guy's and St. Thomas NHS Foundation Trust also. Can you also please introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, good evening. A real pleasure to be invited to speak. Such esteemed panelists. Yeah, you've introduced me better than I probably can. And of course, there'll be a little bit more in my slides, but yeah, a real pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Okay, and last but not least, we have Bazir Abdul. He's a healthcare science fellow at NHS England. Can you also please introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, good evening. Thank you very much for inviting. Very pleased to be here and being a panelist, and I am a clinical engineer myself, and I would introduce a bit more about myself and my job roles during the talk. Thanks very much.
Amazing. Okay, so we'll start with Nana. Can you please, as an introduction, please tell us more about the role of clinical engineering? Clinical engineers and biomedical engineers, are they the same? Is it different?
Thank you. So COVID has presented challenges within the healthcare system, but what it has done has also, it has highlighted the unseen professions that contribute to ensuring that the health system works. So, and also it's highlighted the crucial role that medical equipment play in patient care. This has led to highlighting the role that clinical engineers play. So currently I work on a new hospital build, and we were in the process of completing the build of our IT systems and procuring medical devices when we were hit by COVID, but we continue to procure our technology. Therefore, I'm going to use the next 10 minutes to give you the overview of the role of clinical engineers in health settings, my personal career journey as a clinical engineer, including lessons learned, my current role as an engineer having evolved into the IT space, and the impacts of COVID on technology evaluation. I would also include in my presentation opportunities that post-COVID would present for clinical engineers. So as mentioned, clinical engineers assume two main functions, so medical equipment management and supporting and advancing care. Traditionally, clinical engineers in healthcare settings have the responsibility of managing the full life cycle of medical devices, which includes providing input into procurement of devices, developing equipment support plans, providing reactive and corrective maintenance, performing verification tests, and also retirements of assets. Clinical engineers also have a responsibility of managing medical devices inventory, which is traditionally used to improve clinical equipment productivity. However, during the COVID, asset register has turned out to be a very essential thing. So it's helped to understand device utilization rates, which means that engineers were quick to respond to put devices in places that were needed most. And also, the asset registers are also used to plan stock control as well. So this was really valuable in understanding what the demand is and working close to supply chain. Clinical engineers also play essential roles in supporting patient care. So clinical engineers are involved in training on medical devices and also incident management, where we take a systems approach in performing root cause analysis during adverse events where medical equipment are involved. So understanding the user, understanding the problem from a user perspective, understanding the environment that the equipment is being used, also from a perspective, and being able to produce a root cause analysis of that event. Also, the role of clinical engineers have evolved into developing quality management system. And these are standards that we use to demonstrate that we are able to provide that consistent services that meet the customer, in our case, as the patients and also our clinical users and carers, and regulatory requirements. So as technology has advanced, I'm going to talk about my personal journey, starting from a place where management of equipment used to be at component fault finding level. That was about 12 years ago, and technology has advanced, and maintenance of this equipment have now become more of taking a systems approach. But throughout my journey as well, and as technology advances, I've also experienced the challenges that we faced with device data security. So my personal journey, I had high expectations after my MSc, having traveled from Ghana to study my MSc here in the UK, but not landing a graduate job. At that time, it felt a bit disappointing. However, I was still determined to get a foot in the door in healthcare. And so I accepted a medical device coordinator role. At that time, it looked like a portering role, but I owned it. I visited other teaching hospitals that had been successful in deploying medical equipment library. I implemented this in my role, and this gained attention of the leaders. More funding was obtained, and then I moved on to train on servicing the devices that are in the medical equipment library. And this is how I transitioned from becoming a medical equipment library, taking a lead role on implementing the service and training other people to take it on, and then moving into the workshop where I was performing repairs, maintenance, leading on our quality management system implementation, and also cleaning up our asset data management system. Having worked in that area for a couple of years, I moved on to a more patient-facing role, and that is another aspect of clinical engineering. I worked in assistive technology, where I assessed children with complex communication and physical disabilities to be able to access their environment. And so for children who traditionally couldn't isolate a finger to use a touch screen, look at other solutions that they'll be able to use their computers in school, but not just in school, but also when they are home, to be able to operate things like their remote control, either with their eye or any voluntary part of their body that they are able to move. After a few years, I had a bit of thought and I wanted to change roles, but I had opportunity of getting a new job, which was in device risk management. So I had gone back again into the hospital environment, working with medical devices. At this point, I was working more in operations, and I was also leading medical devices procurement. But what I learned from my journey was making an intentional choice to lead. And this is very critical in my journey. Working in an assistive technology sector, I knew parents who were anxious that their children were going into hospital but couldn't communicate. And the parents were the only people who actually knew how to communicate with the parents. And so putting a child in a hospital meant that parents were anxious to leave the wards even when they needed to have a cup of coffee. And so when I went back into the main hospital with this knowledge, I applied for an innovation fund, and then set up an equipment library where therapists would access equipment, off-the-shelf equipment that everyone is familiar with, very easy to use, but very quick to be able to have conversations with patients who have difficulties in communicating. And also for ICU patients who had trachees, etc., looking at other ways that they were able to access their own technology, which they use as part of our day-to-day life. Again, this is that making that intentional choice to lead. It wasn't the traditional role, it wasn't my role, but it was leading without authority, getting together a group of therapists who had the same vision, who envisaged how this solution would help and support patients, and then coming together and deploying the solution. But the second thing was, whilst I was in this role, WannaCry hit the country. At that point, we had deployed our electronic patient record, and a lot of clinicians were requesting for medical devices that we were evaluating to be integrated into our electronic patient record. And so I had to be very proactive because of the implications and the amount of time that it took us to even understand how we've been affected as a hospital by the WannaCry. Through this, I developed a strategy for managing cybersecurity. But what this did was, it actually changed my approach and my perception of medical device. And device security evaluation became something that I saw as a key thing anytime we were deploying medical devices. My role has evolved. Technology has advanced. And now I'm working in an organization where patient first. We're providing a lot of data to the patient to empower the patients. We're deploying technology that would enable patients to have access to their health record. This requires understanding the security components. However, this is also where technology is going. And as a clinical engineer, that is how my role has evolved. And so to be able to provide a clinical engineering service that meets the strategic aims of the organization, I have to make sure in my day-to-day role that devices that we are procuring, we would be implementing, meet these organizational strategic aims, and also make sure that we have clear visibility of any security-related issues of medical or vulnerabilities of medical devices that we intend to deploy in order to put in the right infrastructure to meet those needs. As I mentioned, as a clinical engineer working on a new build where technology evaluation now has to be done remotely, we need to carry on with the project. My role as a clinical engineer has to change. I have to shift the way we traditionally procure medical devices. So in a hospital, we'll bring the technology in, we'll make sure that clinicians are comfortable with the user interface, not just clinicians. For example, if we had to put a bed into a hospital, we'd have to make sure that for the person moving the beds around, it's not injuring and they wouldn't end up with injuries to their back. For the fleb who is taking the bloods, the trolley is in the right place, the patient will be comfortable, and the patient in the bed has to be comfortable. There's so many things, and this has to be done when you physically see the equipment. However, this isn't possible in this season. And therefore, as a clinical engineer, I have to envisage how our environment would look and also understand what IT infrastructure we've got in plant, and then have that collaborative conversation with clinicians to understand their workflows before going into any technology evaluation kickoff calls. It has really changed the way we approach things, but it hasn't stopped what we are doing. There have been some challenges, but I've had to evolve. I've had to change the way I think about, the way I do things to be able to meet what these changes are. Also, as we go through our equipment selection, I have started thinking about what is post-COVID going to look like. Is there going to be a regulation where we have to use, all consumables have to be single use, for instance? And so even if we've purchased certain equipment, I'm going back and re-evaluating and looking at how potentially when we go post-COVID, how this will be able to meet our needs if, for instance, from regulatory perspective, if it changes. Working in IT, which is a very unique role that Cleveland Clinic has taken. Traditionally, there isn't clinical engineering and in IT. I am very grateful and pleased that I am in this space. And part of my role is to collaborate with our application teams in the development of software, also looking at introducing these new technologies, some of which are mainstream, but introducing them into the hospital environment. Also, I own our middleware, which allows us to connect data that we are sending out from our equipment, which provide continuous monitoring. So, for instance, our ventilators, our anesthetic machines, our patient monitoring solutions. We have a middleware which collates all the data and then puts this into the patient record. Also, there are opportunities when you're collecting a lot of patient data. Things around looking at alarm fatigue at the patient's bedside. I also have oversight of our medical equipment management services who will be responsible for our life cycle management of medical devices. As I mentioned at the start of my presentation, COVID has presented some opportunities for clinical engineers. So as a clinical engineer, to be able to perform that horizon scanning in order to meet our emerging needs. An example, some of the ways that I've been thinking about is how we can be creative in remote monitoring to reduce contact and also reduce trips into outpatient clinics. And also thinking about non-invasive remote monitoring and also remote oxygen saturation. But as I've said, technology is changing and advancing, and clinical engineers are in a place where we are delivering these innovative solutions to improve patients' care. And so we have that role to support with the adoption and implementation of the technology. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nana. That was very instructive. I think we will reserve the question at the end. So now if we can move to Didi.
Hi, okay.
Hi. Can you please tell us about coordinating a regional response to the current crisis?
Sure. Similarly, I've got some slides, so you just bear with me. Can you see my slides now?
Yeah.
Excellent. So yeah, I've got quite a few slides here. I'll speed through them. And Nana has said so much of it already and really well. So I mean, really, there are two things that I'm gonna speak to you about, and I hope they'll be interesting. One of them is my life as an introduction to my life as a clinical biomedical engineer, and one of them is around the COVID response and the role that my view into that experience. One thing you'll notice is there are lots of different terms for clinical engineering, clinical biomedical engineering. It's one of those fields, it's many things, and it's extremely diverse in terms of the amounts of different roles and the different directions they've arrived from. So some might have come from more workshop-based, some come from a basic science angle as well. And the field, the flavor that I'm really involved in is similar to Nana's in that it's you might call it health technology management. It's how we deal with the hospital or the healthcare system as a whole. And in terms of what that involves, I'm just going to show you, this is from my team's own sort of work streams. Our overarching goal is as broad as maximizing the value delivered through medical technology. And that can mean many different things. In terms of our drivers, we want to minimize harm to the patient. We want to maximize capability, the breadth of different treatments that we're able to deliver. And lots of healthcare, well, basically all healthcare is based on technology. So sometimes when people ask, what is an engineer doing in a hospital? It's actually very fundamental when you think of the history of medicine and how it's developed. So in actually managing the technologies we have, we want to optimize capacity and demand. And that's definitely true in the COVID pandemic on a countrywide scale. And we of course want to minimize costs. And you know, there are lots of different streams of work that are involved in that, including some of the more academic side of things. Also things to do with the maintenance support, the technology adoption, and lots of things that I think that Nana has covered really well. So that's just one overview that I tend to use. And there are different types, as I mentioned, where we deal with health technology management, I think we tend to be a central service dealing with all areas of a trust. And the thing about a hospital is, if you walk into one department and then another, the technologies they use can be as different as chalk and cheese. And what you will find is you'll have lots of specialists and you'll have some people who are more general. And I think my team falls more into the more general system-facing role. So as Nana said, you're really dealing with people, machines, systems, infrastructure, policy, and liability, like many engineers in other fields as well. And I'm sure it will resonate with those in different engineering professions when I say often it's the soft skills that make a big difference and the perseverance. And that sounds like it's a big part of Nana's story. Bit of an awkward diagram from the past, but really it's just to say that the way in which we shape healthcare services through design activity and really having this design view is often influenced, in our case, by a really interesting balance of things. The resources that we have, as you'll know, because it's often a headline, are in flux. not just in terms of money, it's about technology, technological capability. You'll hear about new technologies coming into play in the last few months. The turnaround is huge. It's more in terms of medical device patents than it is with pharma. We have workforce challenges, really diverse roles that we need to cater for. And we need to sort of factor that into making the most of technology. At the same time, need is something that's quite dynamic. We are subject to all the media emphases. If something becomes a scandal, then there's a tendency for the system to react to that. But we've got to keep our eyes focused on what's best for the patient and the population that we serve. So I won't go into that awkward diagram too much, but I'll just say this, that I find my role interesting both for how deep it is and the breadth of work you can be involved in. So sometimes the innovation that we do is about optimizing simple tasks that are done at scale across huge organizations, like NHS Trust, if it's NHS, or places like the Cleveland Clinic. But also you get some deep dives into interesting technology, and you always have to adapt. So for example, you might use tracking technologies in your engineering fields, and in a hospital, we've got to think about how we keep track of equipment so we can manage it effectively, deal with risks, all the recalls that we have to deal with, clinical incidents, because these are risky technologies often. And sometimes it's just about tracking things procedurally, and sometimes it can be about maybe looking at our site, looking at how we build up the infrastructure so we can have something a bit more real time, and thinking about the different processes, business processes that's going to speed up, and how ultimately that's going to benefit the patient. Those can be extremely interesting. So one day you might be looking at a project like that, and the next one, a transplant surgeon might show up and say, here's this basic science, bit of research, and we think there's a new procedure in it. We want to improve the usability of deceased donor kidneys so we can move further down the transplant register, and we want to pump blood through those deceased kidneys and make them viable. And you might not have studied the fluidics or even the anatomy or the physiology of the kidney before, but you might have to upskill yourself very quickly, having a general understanding to think about, for example, which sensors do you need to put into this blood circuit? What's the protocol that you need to put in place to make sure that, for example, if there's a blockage in the kidneys, you're pumping warm blood through it, but the kidney will expand and expand and expand. How are you going to detect that pressure? And you have to develop these things to ensure that innovation is done safely and effectively. So effectively, we co-design these solutions. Another one, a procedure where in cancer treatment, you do a process called ablation. So in this case, there's a cryoablation form of it where you're destroying cancerous tissue, for example, in a tumor that's on the bone. And there is an engineering challenge to how this actually works. There's also an engineering challenge to how you implement this in practice. So cryoablation involves using cryogases. They're supercooled, they're compressed, and bringing them into a hospital, which might not have been designed with that in mind, means you've got to think about what happens if there is a leak. And given they are cryo-cooled, you could, if you don't take the proper precautions, suffocate everyone on the floor of a building because you haven't minimized the time that these cylinders spend in the hospital. You haven't mitigated that risk, and you haven't put the appropriate sensors in place. So we think about engineering the system to deliver these new technologies. And so lots of risk assessment and calculation, working with our estates and facilities engineers, and these problems are as varied as that. So, I mean, that's just a few examples, and there are lots of different types of engineers as well. And what I think of for the profession as a whole is that you're able to define your own path because there's no shortage of work, there's no shortage of challenge or opportunity. And my personal journey has involved some research, doing some work, perhaps on the soft systems side a bit, actually understanding and mapping out some of the factors that affect the different decisions we make and the interventions that we build into a hospital, and particular ways of representing that and drawing that out, but also sometimes applying that to different challenges. So for example, You can apply it to education and training and development of clinical staff in a hospital. Viewing that as an engineering systems problem, how can you draw out those confounders, those different knotty issues that need to be dealt with, and how can you draw that into an engineered system? And some of my research also involves some analytics around how you look at trade-offs. So I think that there are other opportunities to get involved where we work across the wider system too. So part of my journey was early on spending some time working with a US engineering charity called Engineering World Health, and spending some time there in Central America working on equipment. And that was my first real experience of clinical engineering. And later on, I worked on a link with Zambia, with engineers there, where it's a very different circumstance, but many of the same challenges. And that's a really good way to get close to the challenge and understand at its core that as engineers in a multidisciplinary environment, we often have to fight for our place, and for people to understand where we sit amongst the doctors and the nurses. Otherwise, I did some more studying, actually another doctorate and research to do with how we model the demand and the importance of different devices to what we're doing, and developing some analytics around predicting where certain high-cost devices will fail. And just skip through bits, and there is a research active part of our profession, and there are opportunities to present some of this work, and perhaps to expand that and think a little bit more forward-going. So we're not just always on the back foot. So reflections from my career is that I've enjoyed that variety of products, and I've enjoyed the opportunities and the complexity that we deal with. The challenges is realizing that there really is a human effort to actually getting these opportunities and working with others well. And the challenge can be the complexity as well. I'll skip through so I can get to the coronavirus side of things. So I don't need to give you the background of COVID-19 or the timeline we've been to, but I have to name drop in there to say that Boris was in my hospital, or one of the ventilators that we brought in. But I did want to show you this. So if the body isn't complex enough, and if the medical device isn't complex enough, the system we work in becomes very complex. And this is probably a very neat picture about how we've worked in COVID, and kind of working from the top down, UK government at the top, and clinical engineers doing lots of implementation down at the bottom there. And I won't go into this except to say that it shows some of that complexity that is probably shown a bit more simply here. In the COVID-19 response in the UK, there have been sort of high level national decisions that have sort of echoed down that system, and at a regional level, engineers have had to think about, well, where do we allocate the equipment to? How do we solve certain problems? How do we deal with new infection prevention control issues? And then there's the local reality where lots of engineers actually operate. And the challenge we have is trying to get that engagement upstream, bringing the understanding from the local picture where we're actually closer to the coalface with the patient, back into those national decisions. So there's always a challenge, and it might be the same in other fields, to get the profile of engineers up. And in COVID-19, you would have seen in the news that there's lots of centralized procurement. So the UK buying lots of medical equipment quickly as it became available in the context of a global shortage. And there became a bit more of a command and control type of way of working, which has its advantages. It means that we can think as an NHS as a whole, as a health system as a whole across the country. But it also meant that we had to rapidly establish new supply chains. We had to quickly make people understand who are doing the purchasing what they need to consider in terms of medical devices, what it needs to means to keep them going. And that had to be done at breakneck speed. And often then dealing with the consequences of where we didn't quite get it right first time. So the main challenge, as I thought, is getting the right equipment to the right place, right time, right condition. meant securing supply, escalating need and communicating a lot, trying to forecast where the shortfalls are going to be, and actually being able to mobilize medical equipment. So if we don't have enough ventilators, for example, we need to get them to the place in the country where they're most needed. And as Nana said, it's taken lots of leadership, lots of people stepping up, making themselves known in order to make certain things work relatively well during the pandemic. And some examples would be here, lots of emphasis on teamwork. Actually, this character in the here in the mask is Iskender Solomon, who you hear from later. I'm wary of going on too long, but lots of teamwork and coordination was required, pulling together the efforts of lots of teams, working in unfamiliar ways. In the national and regional initiatives that I was involved in are perhaps advocating for clinical engineers, meeting with the Cabinet Office, representing London, and that has meant actually doing lots of that informing work, letting them know that perhaps, you know, this sort of information might need to go out, these considerations might need to be put in place. There was a really great team in the north of the country that did something called technical due diligence. So all the new ventilators that are unfamiliar that were bought in, actually testing them and making sure they're fit for use, prioritizing which ones go out. Also, we were involved in developing new facilities, which I'm sure Iskender will talk about, and developing new systems and processes. So setting up logistics hubs to enable that new equipment to come in, be processed and moved to the right place through new information systems. So we're involved in that. But lots of the interest is locally. As I said, this is just a mock-up. We had to predict what our shortfall would be, so we could look at our various different options of getting the medical equipment we needed. Also, being involved further, much earlier on, anytime you hear about a novel ventilator, there are clinical engineers who have to kind of evaluate those or govern the clinical evaluation, like clinical trials for them. And lots of trusts like mine got involved with that. And so we were dealing with shortages in equipment, in workforce, and in training resources. And it was a team effort in dealing with that. So this is my final slide to be glad to hear. In terms of lessons learned from that and where we're going, there's much more of this thinking about engineering the system itself, unblocking different issues, making better use of information and informatics to drive better decisions, and working better with others. And potentially that international collaboration has to be brought into scope as well. So that's me. I think there'll be time for questions later on, but for now, I hope that's been interesting to you.
Yes, it was very much. And also, before moving to Iskender, can I ask everyone who has a question to put them in the chat box? That way it will be easier when we get to that. So now we'll speak to Iskender now about the quick response to expanding ICU capacity in the London healthcare network.
Try and share my screen. Hopefully you can see my screen.
Yeah.
Excellent. So I'll also share my Nightingale journey. So I was fortunate enough not to only have been involved fairly early on in terms of the Nightingale NHS setup, but also lead a team of clinical scientists who rapidly trained up to become critical care scientists to work on the shop floor at the ICU. So the way I've structured my talk is to give you a little bit of a background in terms of my career path, followed on by effectively how we identified the need for this unique, almost niche workforce called the critical care scientists, who play a very vital role in your typical ICU, let alone one which is effectively a field hospital with being set up very rapidly. And then finally, just tell you a little bit about what I actually did within the ICU at the Nightingale, and then finally distill all that into the main lesson I learned during my experience there. So a little bit about me. I graduated, basically I studied medical engineering and applied physics and graduated from this in 2005. Shortly after that, entered into the clinical scientist training team, of which Didier was also an alumni a couple of years below me. As part of my training, I did 3 subspecialties, one of which is clinical engineering, which both Nana and Didier has told you quite a bit about in terms of what it involves. I also, in addition, specialized in ultrasound. And then finally, in a subspecialty called physiological measurements, but mine was in particular biomechanics, which I really fell in love with. So I really particularly enjoyed the patient contact. I enjoyed effectively how we used fairly complex investigation techniques such as optical motion capture technology, EMG, ultrasound, to really work out how children who have an abnormal walking pattern, what the root cause for their effectively this pattern is, and what kind of surgery or either physiotherapy would be best to improve their gait and prolong their mobility as long as possible. So
sorry, Iskender. I'm not sure if it's only me, but the screen that is being shared is only the core presentation slide, but the slides are not there.
Yeah, I can agree. That's with me too.
Okay.
It looks like the Microsoft PowerPoint is on, but not the slides. So.
Yeah, I think it's another screen that's been shared.
Oh, let's try that again. You can see the slides now?
Yes.
Yeah, now we got it.
Yeah, that's it.
Perfect. My apologies, not sure. I'm using the Prezi app to try and be fancy, but this is the price you pay for try and be fancy, I guess. Hopefully you've got my slides now, so I will just tell you a little bit about me. I think we've covered the training scheme, a little bit about clinical engineering, ultrasound, and I think I was here where I was telling you a little bit about biomechanics and why I fell in love with it. What you can see now is effectively what you do during a biomechanic assessment. You try and identify the underlying cause for the abnormal walking pattern that you might see, whether it's muscles, bones, or a combination of both, which allows you to better target treatment. So I really fell in love with this placement, really. It was very patient-centered. We're using innovative technology. We were informing management. And then because of my supervisor at the placement, who truly believed there was no true boundary between what clinical scientists can do and effectively clinicians or doctors do, I became very clinical in my aspirations. And a few years later, I got a job in UCLH as a principal clinical scientist in physiological measurements. My subspecialty was urodynamics. Urodynamics is a group of investigations which assess bladder function, and by measuring pressures, volumes, flows, and the anatomy of the bladder and the kidneys and the urethra, we can work out exactly what the underlying cause for a patient who may have bladder issues is. So we can work out effectively if a patient is going to the toilet too often, is unable to pee, is incontinent, has issues related to the bladder that's causing kidney dysfunction, we can really work out the true root cause. And disappointingly, although this is effectively a technique or a physiological measurement that's been around since 1876, it's very poorly understood, very poorly utilized really, and in terms of what clinicians understood of the test and how it directly relates to the patient symptom and how you can inform management, it was barely scratching the surface. So I knew this was a huge opportunity for us to make an impact. As clinical scientists, we have sound understanding of the underlying physics. We can very quickly learn about the anatomy and physiology relevant to this field, and I knew I could make a difference. So I very quickly set out to try and make a difference in that way by publishing, teaching it, publicizing as well as I could. And fast forward to a few published articles in this area, lots of international teachings. And a few years later, I was working my way towards a consultant post as a clinical scientist in this field. Along the way, however, there was effectively a research that I had held close to my heart, and I was looking for an opportunity to do part-time alongside my physiological measurement day job, and that was trying to better assess children with scoliosis. As you may know, children who have scoliosis, a deformity of the spine, get routine x-rays, and a fair few of them, around 60%, develop, if they have more than 25 x-rays in their lifetime, breast cancer. So this is quite a significant cancer risk we're exposing these kids. And due to my ultrasound experience and my exposure to 3D ultrasound, the GATE lab, which I mentioned earlier, where we were looking at children's muscles in 3D, I knew perhaps this would be an opportunity to better transfer this technology. So I applied for an NIHR doctoral fellowship, and I was fortunate enough to be awarded it. So it was a 6-year part-time doctoral fellowship in which I developed scoliosis 3D ultrasound monitoring system. And what we basically did is we captured 2D slices of the spine and we tracked the probe. So we knew the orientation of the ultrasound probe and its position. And by stacking up these slices and by rendering it so we can work out exactly where the boundaries of the bone is, we can render the spine in 3D. And that gives you far more information. It can tell us about the side bend, and it can tell us also about the axial rotation, which is rotating with itself. That gives you a lot of information. So in line with that, fast forward again a few years later, in 2006, I was fortunate enough to be appointed as a consultant clinical scientist at the urology department at Guy's and St. Thomas's and at the pediatric nephrourology department at the Evelina Children's Hospital. I was delighted with this post because it gave me everything I'd hoped for. I'd protected time to do clinical work, but also I'd protected time to do teaching and also research in this field, as well as other fields in which I felt I could contribute using my engineering knowledge. I was really enjoying the field, you know, trying to make as much as I can. And then COVID hit in March 2020 this year. And all elective procedures such as urodynamics shut down. So I thought to myself, how can I possibly help? I volunteered to work with Didi. Didi very cleverly avoided me and sent me to the workshop. And while I was there, I ran into his boss actually, and a chance encounter meant that Didi's boss, Steve Clevel, who's the director of medical physics at Guy's and St. Thomas's, was being asked for clinical engineering input in terms of workforce development at a new field hospital, which they were setting up. That was before the Nightingale had its name. And there began my journey for the Nightingale. So from this chance encounter, I was then asked to consult to NHS England with regards to the workforce development. And although they had thought about effectively how many doctors they need, how many nurses they need, they overlooked a very key group of people. These are the critical care scientists, and who play that very important role of liaising between the technical and the clinical workforce within an ICU department. Considering this was going to be a field hospital made up of huge number of devices or models, basically with no standardization, all basic clinical engineering principles go out the window. There's going to be a huge number of device diversity, as well as clinicians who never worked in an ICU department I knew would be very pivotal for this department. So my first task really was to try and assess what this workforce gap analysis would be. So I'd figured out in a potential 4,000 bed hospital, such as the Nightingale, probably need about 1 to 20 to 50 bed, one of these scientists. And the role really would be a combination of clinical and technical functions. So clinically, in a typical ICU, critical care scientist would help optimize the ventilation parameters. So they would look at the ventilation parameters of the patient and work out whether they're taking too long to inhale, taking not enough of a deep breath, looking at their oxygen saturations and the CO2 clearance, and working out what needs to be turned up, what needs to be turned down. But at the same time, they also had the technical background, so they could work out when equipment's not working, very quickly troubleshoot it and minimize downtime. And considering how scarce ventilation were in particular, this would be something that would be very much needed. So what we needed to do is find these people. So this is quite tricky because, of course, every hospital who has, which has a critical care scientist was massively in demand, or was hugely wanting to hold on to these people. But we had a pool of clinical scientists who have a combination of clinical experience and technical experience who we could tap into and whose day-to-day clinics had been cancelled. So we tried to recruit as quickly as we can. We essentially had a 2-week period in which to recruit these people, train them up, and potentially staff this massive hospital that was imminently opening. So we did everything we can to get the word out. This is my tweet, my most retweeted and most commented on tweet. Before this, I only had 6 followers, of which one of is my mum. But very quickly, thankfully, the professional bodies picked it up. It was well circulated. And over a weekend, we had over 150 volunteers wanting to take part to help out. So that was really good. So we weren't short of people. Now we needed to figure out exactly how we were going to train them. In terms of training them, we looked at what they needed to do, and what they needed to have is a combination of ICU-specific clinical skills as well as technical skills. In terms of the ICU-specific clinical skills, I worked with a Bristol group who deliver ICU ventilation course to doctors, and to try and tailor-make it so that we could take effectively a group of clinical scientists who are non-specialists in this area and give them all the anatomy and physiology and pathophysiology knowledge, as well as ventilator-specific clinical training they will need. And they're very kind enough to modify their course and very quickly deliver it, and they delivered it to 2 cohorts that we put through. In terms of the technical skills, we worked with a group that normally deliver technical training to biomedical engineers, and we delivered it on the most populous device types in an ICU setting. So that would be ventilators, infusion pumps, and monitors. We worked out effectively what the most common faults would be, how to troubleshoot them, how to first line repair them, obviously do a lot of the initial acceptance testing as well, which we may be required to because we are having a huge influx of equipment. So we put through a cohort of 60 clinical scientists to prepare them for their role at the Nightingale. So finally, it all kicked off, and I believe it was the 1st of April that we had our first shift. So we subdivided our first cohort of 23 into 4 sub-teams, and the role at the Nightingale involved effectively 2 days, 2 night shifts, each 12.5 hours long, fully kitted out in PPE. And for people who are used to working typically 9 to 5, of course, in a very non-COVID environment, this was definitely a challenge and required acclimatization. And our initial role there was effectively troubleshooting the finger trouble, which a lot of non-specialist doctors had. Of course, there was a huge diversity in the device types, so therefore it was very challenging for clinicians to learn how to operate and be comfortable using all of these various devices. So we made sure we were very good at, we were effectively trained to a super user level, and we could troubleshoot and help any finger trouble any clinician would be having. We provided on-the-floor training to all the new cohorts of doctors and nurses coming through. We would walk around from bay to bay, looking at every patient's ventilator parameters and just making sure they're optimized. So all the ventilation parameters in terms of the ventilation, inhalation and exhalation parameters, both in terms of the pressure with which you force that into the lungs, the timings of these are optimal. So, you optimize oxygen saturation into the blood and minimize the amount of carbon dioxide that is floating around the patients. And effectively, we worked very closely with the clinical engineering team and then PPE side on the outside wall to make sure that if there was any kit that wasn't working that we couldn't immediately troubleshoot and fix on the floor, we swapped out as very quickly as we can to minimize the downtime of equipment and make sure we're not compromising patient care. Unlike in most environments, of course, if things don't work, ventilation is something which needs to work, and within minutes, obviously, a patient can have a very poor outcome if ventilation is compromised. So it's a very high stakes game, and it requires some degree of getting used to this pressure of trying to get it right all the time. So finally, if I could distill my lesson learned from this whole experience, I think Lana and Didi have discussed their own versions, but for me, if I could take away one thing from reflecting on this, it's probably summarized by these super cringe Instagram quotes, which effectively try and say we should probably put ourselves forward for things which make us uncomfortable, because it's often these things which often lead to great experience. And for me, that was the Nightingale, really. So I fairly early knew that actually the lungs are not that different to the bladder. The bladder is one I'm very comfortable with. Effectively using my sound understanding of engineering principles and science. Effectively, we assess bladder function by looking at pressures, volumes, compliance, resistance, and effectively this is something that would very easily translate to the lungs. And so it didn't take us long as a group of clinical scientists to very quickly become very competent in a subspecialty that we'd never before properly heard of or had any competency in. So I think by allowing ourselves to demonstrate just how versatile and how useful we can be, not just on the technical side, which I believe we've to some degree done, but also clinically, I think we've showed ourselves we can very in a very versatile manner respond to any pandemic or the future, because we have effectively the underlying scientific brain that allows us to very quickly adapt to both the clinical and technical challenges of any pandemic or the future may present. So that's it from me, and I'm sure when we have some questions, I'll be glad to answer them at the end.
Amazing. Thank you very much for sharing your experience. Must have been intensive, but we'll come back to that later. Now can we move to Bassett, who will talk to us about the future progression for clinical and biomedical engineering.
Hi, thank you very much. I do not have any presentation. I'm extremely glad by listening to these 3 presentations so far. So rich presentation by Nana and the explanation of the clinical engineering, such a rich experience of Didi, and ultra super technical presentation, Skinder. Well, I'm bringing everyone a bit down to, I hope will not disappoint with my presentation, having no PowerPoint. I'm conscious of time as well, but I hope it will not be too long. What I'm going to talk about is a brief introduction of my career as a clinical engineer, and then I was, based on that, my current role, the coordination that I helped and did with the regional team in London, NHS England, for the COVID response, and then career progression and where the market needs are in the clinical biomedical engineering, and some tips to enter into the profession, considering the today's audience. So I am, as I mentioned, clinical engineer. My first degree is electronics engineering. I did that back in Pakistan. Then I came to the UK, had my first MSc as medical electronics and physics, and started my career in the NHS as a junior clinical engineer in one of the London hospitals. Some time passed, some around the lines of Nana's experience, had a number of different job roles, finally into the management of the clinical engineering. And then later, by around 2014-16, I did my second MSc, which was through the NHS Leadership Academy, and the title was something around healthcare leadership. That gave me another dimension to my career. And as today we have listened to so many beautiful, such rich careers around the clinical engineering. It looks like it is a beautiful flower, and each role is a petal around it, from HTM to research to device manufacturing to R&D, the risk assessment, safety elements. So it's such a beautiful flower, the clinical or biomedical engineering is. And it excites me day in, day out. And that actually leads, when I go back from my electronics engineering, and I had no idea that what this clinical engineering is all about. I was an electronics engineer and did some work in the industry. And while looking for courses not in the UK, in Sweden as well, and I found that, wow, something that I did back in my electronics engineering as my final year project, that was a telemedicine project. And it came to me looking at the course in Queen Mary's that there is a complete MSc course that links the electronics engineering with medical engineering. And then rest is the history. So that is my very quick, brief introduction. And finally, for the last 4 years, from 2016, I am more involved in training and workforce development for London and Kent, Surrey, Sussex region, and predominantly using the healthcare science apprenticeships we have. So I was involved in the development of the apprenticeships, the development of the curriculum, and also help promote all the trusts within London and KSS region to grow healthcare science apprenticeship. And very quickly, clinical engineering and biomedical engineering is a part of 54 various specialisms under a single umbrella word called healthcare science. So as Eligia introduced me in the beginning, so I'm a healthcare scientist, fellow, doing the fellowship within NHS England. So coming to present, I have two job roles at the moment. One is and with NHS England, and that is a fellowship, and where I help London KSS region to grow healthcare science apprenticeships. And the other one is more operational, that is at Barts Health NHS Trust. There I design, develop, and execute clinical engineering apprenticeships. And within that role, I do collaborate with other trusts, neighboring trusts, like as in St. Thomas's, Royal Free Hospital, and UCL, all on the London-based hospitals to collaborate and have a richer experience for our next generation clinical engineers during their training through apprenticeships. So that's my current role. Coming to the coordination element for this COVID response, thinking back in mid-March, the discussions started. So let's put a question that why coordination, why this regional coordination was required or needed. Having with my Barts role, I had some insights into the issues the clinical engineers were facing. One was the equipment procurement. Every trust was looking into buying or having more and more equipment, mainly ICU equipment to have the COVID response, but in silos. And the other one is the training workforce, actually, because a fairly large portion of our workforce was off sick because of COVID. I talked to my line manager, who is the scientific director for London region in NHS England. And we, in our meeting, herself and other fellows, so we have in total six fellows. Some are clinical engineers, other from other specialisms of healthcare science. So we had some discussions, and it was not only one-sided discussion, but on the other side, she was asking us about what equipment do you have, because she had this understanding and was attending meetings at regional level about the national procurement that was happening, actually, and the teams from the national procurement where clinical engineers were not present. They were asking about what equipment is required and where to deploy the equipment that they have already purchased through various intelligence, of course. And that was one bit, like the logistics of equipment, and the other bit was the NHS England teams. They coordinated with private healthcare providers, and thankfully they gave their medical devices to be used in other NHS hospitals in London region. So those equipment had to go to various trusts within London region, but we were not sure that where the need is and which model and manufacturer of the equipment will be more useful in those hospitals. So there was a need to understand what their asset registers look like, just like as Nana in the beginning mentioned about the asset registers. So, so that was one of the challenge. The other challenge was innovation. So as I believe everyone is aware of, the ventilator challenge was made by the government, not only in this country, other countries as well, and other challenges around the oxygen supply and other type of medical equipment was also getting highlighted, and people in research and development and manufacturers, they wanted to develop things, but they needed information and even the test equipment from clinical engineering department, and they were contacting myself and many other colleagues as well to reach out. Local issues I just mentioned, and also one bit I would like to highlight is I am a member of IFMBE, which is International Federation for Medical and Biological Engineering. they have one of their divisions is clinical engineering division. So I'm a member of that for some years. So having an insight there, I was aware of what's happening in other countries. As we know, Italy, China, Iran was ahead of us, and there were many lessons that could be shared within our clinical engineering departments. So there were information, there were bits of information, but in silos that had to be linked to each other so we could help not at local level, but regional and national level and international, of course. And now moving to how did we do this? The first thing is that it all happened within days. And one of the major benefit was the pre-existing information or the knowledge about the personal context. So me, before joining the training development profession, my career in training and development, until 2015, I was head of clinical engineering in a London hospital. So I had the contacts details of many of the clinical engineers, but not, of course, all of them. And within our fellows, we started working on developing spreadsheets, contact details. LinkedIn was one of the best source, phone calls. And in a couple of days' time, we had a list of all the clinical engineering departments, heads of details of their heads, deputy heads, and we reached out. And as Didi mentioned, this was more a command and control level. It was level 4 within NHS England in terms of its different levels defined. So it was a command and control situation. So we reached out to all of them, asking for their asset register to understand how many ventilators they have, what makes and models, and what type of monitoring systems everyone has. So the national procurement could allocate accordingly. And from there, we started our weekly meetings, and it is still ongoing. Every Wednesday we meet 8 a.m. All the London clinical engineering managers, and it's a very useful. Everyone is benefiting, and the information is going both directions. Didi mentioned about the cabinet office, work very closely with Didi and other heads of clinical engineering departments, and they are representing not only the London region, but also representing London in rest of the country's regional clinical engineering network. I feel proud to mention that our London clinical engineering network was the first one in the country, and from there, rest of the regions were developed, and now we are benefiting from each other's experience. So one bit was, I mentioned about the IFMBE, is that there is a lot of webinars, information sharing that is happening, and because of now the region is established, that information is also being shared with the other nations, and their experience is being shared with us. So we are learning from each other and, of course, helping. Now I will quickly move to the next bit of career progression. So we learned today a great deal about clinical engineering specialisms, the types of job roles, and all of these are amazing. And the core, which, for example, Nana mentioned about the patient-centeredness, we all work to make sure the patient gets the benefit. That is our center. One bit where the clinical engineers are a bit missing, it won't be wrong to say, is the table where the decisions are made. For example, the CCGs, at the higher level, where the clinical engineering decisions are made, the clinical engineers are not present or not present enough. So one of my lessons, and the one I try to all the time share, is we need to work hard. We need to be focused on outside of our specialism, which is going into more leadership roles and making sure we are present more at the decision level within NHS England, within the government, with the other local bodies, wherever there is a decision on medical device, clinical engineers should be there. And one of the bits, the lessons learned, I would say, is mentor and coach is something my journey's lesson is. I can't emphasize more on having a mentor. I would say every clinical engineer, no matter where they are in their career, they should be having a mentor, and mentors help them grow in a direction that helps them. And just to quickly highlight here that there is sometimes it gets confused, but we need to fully understand what is a mentor, what's the role of mentor, and what qualities of mentor should look like, and the difference between mentor and coach. This is not a right platform, but I would encourage everyone to just quickly understand and then have a mentor, and even have a mentor and a coach for your career, no matter whether you are in the clinical engineering career or anyone. And if you want to become a clinical engineer, or you are already a biomedical engineer having a qualification or early level clinical engineer, there I would quickly show some entry levels or entry points to this profession. One of a few includes the STP program. The Scientist Training Program is a prestigious program in the UK where the successful candidates get straight away a job at around band 6 within the NHS, and they also get study, they get protected time, and they study towards a master's degree qualification. The other one is a PTP program, which is called Practitioner Training Program. Here, it is same as any other university qualification, a degree level qualification, where student pays their fee, in different to the STP, where the hospital pays their fee. But in PTP program, the candidate students get the chance to spend time in a hospital in their specialized field, or in the specialism they are working in, and that gives them an edge when they go. First of all, they get better understanding, better learning, and once they finish the program, they get already have contacts, understanding of the department, and can give them edge to secure a job. And finally, apprenticeships, which is my job for some years now. We are very lucky as a clinical engineer or healthcare scientist. We have a full spectrum of apprenticeships available, which starts from level 2 to all the way to level 6 or 7. Level 7 means an MSc level apprenticeship. Level 6 means a degree level apprenticeship. And level 2 is a GCSE equivalent. Level 3 is A levels, 4 is higher apprenticeship. So we have a nice progression with that. A school leavers can start a level 2 apprenticeship. They can move to a degree level and all the way to master's level, just like to become a clinical scientist, as Iskender mentioned, and Iskender is a clinical scientist. I have my own apprentices within BARS, with my BARS hat on, and they started school level finishing. Now I'm very glad to see them that they are progressing very well into now doing a degree level. And the beauty is that they are learning in a hospital, in a workshop environment where they get the best of the best experience, plus they get paid for, and we pay for their education as well. So apprenticeship is something I would encourage everyone to look at, either for yourself, your loved ones, your kids, family, friends. Do look for this way of entering into not only clinical engineering or healthcare science, but other professions in the NHS or outside as well. So I would finish this. I appreciate we have very less time left for questions. So I hope this is useful. Ask any questions if you may have. My Twitter handle is @Bassett_HCS, which is healthcare science. So feel free to reach out anyone you want to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bassett. We only have a couple of minutes left, so I will open the floor now for questions.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Hi.
Oh, sorry. I can. Mara here. Firstly, I really, from my heartfelt position, just really want to thank all of the speakers. This is clearly a profession that's been very, very close to my heart. Having had, relatives in this time who have been in ventilators and oxygen, some who have not made it, some who have made it. My own mom having had COVID. So this is a tremendous career that in the last 3 months, I've had so much utmost respect for the innovation in the space. And of course, a little plug in, well, congratulations if you're the one that had, the responsibility of looking after our very own Prime Minister at Guy's and St. Thomas's. But yeah, so it's literally, these have been remarkable presentations. A very much thank you, because it wasn't until now you've really understood the depth of the engineering and innovation that goes into the science. This clinical science. It hasn't been easy just watching people very near and close to you being at their life's end and relying on some of the work that you guys are doing out there. So it just thought I'd start by saying thank you, and also thank you for what have been very brilliant presentations. My question is, again, clearly this has been quite an amazing amount of innovation. You guys sound very expensive and very innovative, and cutting edge innovation, that sounds also very expensive. How does this then relate to being able to lift some of this stuff and carry it into the third sector, so the developing nations? We're hearing a lot of conversations about some countries thinking they can, not thinking they can, talking about innovation where they feel they can deliver this as low cost ventilators. Is this possible? For instance, Senegal is talking about a $1 test kit for COVID. So is some of this innovation that you guys are seeing in your field, is it actually adaptable? And can it be transferred to the sort of the developing world with some very low cost solutions? Because I'm assuming, there's some certain countries whose healthcare systems won't be able to afford the sort of high-end ventilators that we have here and high-end innovation that we have here. So do you think we can actually get that high innovation at such low cost that it's affordable for countries, for instance, in developing nations?
Can attempt to answer there, and thank you very much. Thank you for your kind words as well. I think that there is definitely that opportunity. One of the things that we knew that we would be struggling for example, with a ventilator, is some of them you need a high flow of oxygen or a high flow of air, or on occasion a mixture of the two. And therefore lots of the innovated solutions, which as yet have seen less use in clinics here, they were designed to be able to work with minimal consumables, and to be easily supportable and easy to take on in quite rugged environments that the designers were envisaging. And what that means is lots of the equipment that often gets donated to other countries, it can be very inappropriate. For example, if we don't have a supply of consumables that go with it. With some of these, there's every possibility that they could have use there. And what's more, there may be opportunities at some point, not just for the new and innovative stuff, but the stuff that we've purchased from other less familiar markets that might be familiar in other countries. If there is some secondary use as things die down, countries where they have a much lower number of ventilators per capita, there might be some scope for movement around that around the world. So it would be difficult to say that we commit to anything, because I'm linked to the logistics process for some of this equipment nationally here. But I'd definitely say that the opportunities there and conversations are happening.
So now, sorry.
No, I was just saying, thank you.
Okay, so I was going to move to a question in the chat by Mia. She's asking Nana about remote monitoring of patients, and she's asking for people who are generally who are older if they are happy to be monitored remotely, and if they are happy with if they are not worried about losing their independence.
Thank you. So I'll go back to and talk about the organization that I work with. And one of our strategy is to deliver outstanding quality and personalized pathways to patients. And this would include ensuring access to their data. Also, as an organization, our objective is also to demonstrate and sustain value with our stakeholders. So leveraging technology and a skill to drive clinical and operational efficiencies. There's also a movement called healthcare consumerism, where patients are advocating. It's a movement where they are advocating that they can own their own healthcare decisions. So we have wearables that we wear that are able to track some of these things, and it's about whether the data is valid or not. Remote monitoring in hospitals would be done with a patient consent. That is the first thing. But also with remote monitoring, what it actually does is it gives that it helps us to make data-driven decision making. And remote monitoring, there are two ways. You would either, the patient would have access to the data and would phone the hospital, or the system that is provided to the patient is able to alert the clinic or the service so that they would understand if the patient is, say, maybe declining or not. And the reason why this is really useful is because our healthcare system is actually delivered, or it focuses on very sick people. But if you look at the NHS long-term plan and topo review and some of these government documents that are out there, it talks about prevention rather than cure. And so when we have access to this, it means that you can intervene. So you hear this flow. In the hospital, the floors are sitting because beds, no one is moving out of beds. And so again, this, if you look at it on a bigger picture, there are advantages in remote monitoring. Okay. And also, and people want to own their data. We've got smart technology, and everyone wants to own their data as well. That's what's happening now. Does that answer your question, Mia?
Yes, that does answer the question. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Okay, so I will continue with a question to Askinder. They're asking, how do you keep up morale when you are working with retraining clinical scientists in such extreme and unfamiliar circumstances?
So that's an excellent question. In fact, one of my biggest concerns was not whether we could do the job, but whether we could hack the environment. I mean, most of us are used to working 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, not used to wearing PPEs, not used to working with really ill patients. And if you look at the statistics, around 20 to 30, and in some cases around 40% will make it. So there's both the physical and psychological demand of that environment. So it's something we took very seriously. So we thought about potential well-being supports, really preparing people for the environment, thinking about while we were there, having frequent breaks, having a badging system, and trying to address any concerns before they develop, and when they do, to manage them really well. So we had an exercise program on our days off. So we ended up being a nice little neat family, both on and off the floor, which really got us through, really. So we've really bonded as a group. But yeah, it's massively surprised me, to be honest. It surprised me I could hack it, and it surprised me that everyone did. So you'd be surprised in a situation like that just how much you might rise to the challenge. So yeah, it all ended up being an excellent experience altogether.
Amazing. Okay, so I think this. Mo.
Hi there. Thank you very much. Thank you to all the speakers. I just wanted to ask Basit a question about the best route, because I know you mentioned three. There was the FTP program, there was the PTP program, and there was the apprenticeship. And you mentioned there were different levels for apprenticeship, but I was just wondering, for example, if you were going to do a career change and you, for example, had a master's degree, but you had no knowledge in clinical engineering, what do you reckon the best route is?
I can take this question. In order to do apprenticeship, there are a couple of requirements. One is that the level of knowledge and level of experience should always go higher. So if someone comes with a degree in law, or someone has a law degree and they want to do become a clinical engineer, they can start an apprenticeship at any level. Depends on what is the apprentice. First of all, it's important to understand apprenticeship is a job. There's a job description attached to it. You apply for it and get interviewed. So the department, they put their own criteria. So a person with a law degree, as an example, they can start a clinical engineering depending on their previous qualification to either start at level 4 or even for level 6 to start. However, you cannot start a clinical engineering level 6 program if you already have a degree, similar kind of degree or a master's level. So for example, if you have an engineering degree, you need to justify, and it goes to the university, HEI, who will identify which courses you already have studied. So they will appel that, and they will only teach you those bits which you do not have studied before. So in a summary, in a nutshell, anyone can start an apprenticeship at any time of their life. We have, in BARTS, we have one apprentice, 54 years old. One of my clinical engineering apprentice is in his 40s, and it is a career change. So it's just a matter of finding out what you have done previously and justifying the next level of experience and knowledge.
Okay. I can add to Basit's as well. So just taking my own journey, I'm a registered clinical scientist. I'm currently doing my doctorate. I'm doing the training to be able to register as a consultant clinical scientist, but I didn't go via the STP route. I used equivalence. So I built my experience over a couple of years. With the STP, you have an opportunity to do certain projects in the different aspects of clinical engineering. But over my working period, the last 5 years, I had built experience in device manufacturing. I had built experience in assistive technology. I had worked in device risk management as well. And so I had clinical measurements, and I worked in a hospital. So I spent time in the vascular department, the respiratory department, to do some audits and also understand the physiology behind some of the processes and the procedures that they do, and understand the patient pathway. Through that, I was able to apply for equivalence to become a clinical scientist, worked as a clinical scientist, and proceeded onto the higher specialist scientific training, which allows me to get a doctorate in clinical science. So that has been my journey. I went in as a technician with no experience at all and worked my way up.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. I would just like to apologize first for going over for a few minutes. We're just going to run through quickly the questions that are in the chat, and I'll ask our panelists to be shown. Shimeka is asking, what is the difference between a clinical engineering and biomedical engineering?
I think Basit answered it in the chat very well. In that, you know, there is one of those contested terms, but you could say that clinical engineering is part of biomedical engineering. In the UK, certainly, where you've heard us say registered clinical engineer or registered clinical scientist. And I think it tends to take on that specific meaning. You know, you've gone through the training scheme, that STP scheme, or equivalence, and you're now on a register as a healthcare professional who's a clinical engineer. So often it's that case, but there are lots of biomedical engineers. Some may call themselves clinical engineers who are in, for example, universities, and they might be in R&D. They might be developing the latest MRI head coil. They also have a claim to the title.
Okay, so last question from Mina. How do you each handle managing large teams and projects when the environment can be high pressure, for example, for COVID? Anyone?
Who wants to take that one? Well, I can, I'm happy to start sharing my experiences. I think like any other field, if you're organized and you plan, I think then pressure vastly dissipates really. And we're fortunate enough to have a team that we can lean on. We work well with teams, plan and be organized, and we have to some degree, resources we can then tap into. Obviously COVID limits somewhat or increases timescales of things. But in my experience, for example, trying to rapidly train, a large group of people very quickly to start work in a hospital that's opening in 2 weeks, I found that actually, a lot of people pulled together and stepped up. All you needed to do was ask and just be organized in your process of that. So I think, pressure fast dissipates if you're organized and you ask with a smile.
Yeah. Just a quick add to Iskender. Totally, I agree with what you just said. People love to work for good leaders rather than managers. You need to be you need to understand you need to understand your team's problems, put yourself in their shoes and create a shared purpose and shared goal. Once that is developed, everyone loves to work with you, work more than what they're being paid for, because salary is not only the thing that everyone works for.
Okay.
Yeah, that's all.
So, yeah, so I would like to finish now because I'm conscious of the time. Very huge thanks to our 4 panelists today. Thank you, Didi, Nana, Eskinder, and Bazit. Thank you to all of you also who have attended today's webinar. We'd just like to shout out a few of other upcoming events. We have Basics of Computer Coding this Saturday, and also Skills for Today and Skills for Tomorrow, Tuesday next week. If you can just sign up on our website, please. So thank you very much, and I hope you have a great evening.